Awesome. Next up, we're going to keep rolling with probably an investor you all are all familiar with. We have Mitch Berukowicz, managing partner of Merida Capital Holdings. Mitch, I believe you're back there, my friend. Welcome him to the stage. Give a warm round of applause.
You spent the last 2 days, if you've been here, mostly talking about public stocks. Obviously, that's the easiest way to articulate a way for the average person to invest. So I thought I would, given it's the last day, that I would talk about what Merida sees in how we make our investments and insights that you can actually use, unlike just talking about stocks, the decision-making process and how we get there. So most importantly, Merida has 30 professionals. We're on our 4th fund. And we're largely known for a differentiated, very sophisticated, data-heavy operation. So I tried to make an extended pun about seeing the forest, but for the trees. And so here's the big difference. If you want to see the forest and the trees, which is an important thing to making good investments in cannabis, especially privately, you have to have access to data. Whether it's investing in data companies, raw data, you have to be able to synthesize that data. And then most importantly, you have to turn that data into a contextualized thesis. So this is just a short picture of the Merida ecosystem. And so now I'm going to dive into what are we seeing that make us do the things that we do. I'll give you a few past examples. So right now, this is, I'm sure, a slide, unless you read Merida's newsletter, you haven't seen this. This is a slide of how much THC is in the wastewater in Oregon. So that is, what you're seeing here is a representation of how much pee and other stuff has THC in it in Oregon when legal sales began. So if you look at the low vertical chart, that's the actual legal sales that's going vertical. But if you see the middle chart that's very flat is the metabolites. So the wastewater, if you expect legal sales to begin and legal sales are exploding, you would expect, theoretically, to the same amount of THC to explode because more people are consuming it. But that's not what we discovered. What we discovered is more people were consuming it legally, but that consumption itself wasn't growing nearly as much as the legal sales were growing. So what did that do? 3 years ago, we decided to invest in a thesis we call normalization before legalization, because we discovered that all we were looking at was the transition from the illegal market to the legal market. And that's what drives the sales in Illinois, Michigan. Whenever you see a rec state go and all the sales are exploding, those aren't new consumers. There are new consumers, but the most of the sales are being driven by people who are already consuming, which you can see. So the way we actually kind of say it in brief is when you're tracking the amount of THC and P, you're looking at everything data-wise in the cannabis industry. So here's 3 quick examples of things we did based on data that we thought no one else was noticing. So when we invested in Dharma Pharmaceutical and built it, it was one of the 4 Virginia licensees. There was actually a 5th that MedMen and PharmaCann had negotiated for. So one of the things we noticed that not a lot of people were paying attention to is we were reading all of the legislative dicta in Virginia. And so what it told us is that Virginia was actually very quickly becoming a purple state, number 1. And number 2, it was much more likely to pass a rec law before anyone else had predicted. So most people didn't even think of Virginia as a potential rec state. But 3 years ago, we actually knew it was going to become a rec state well before, and we were proven right when a year later, after the medical law, within a year of the medical law going live, they already passed a rec bill, which we'll see when rec sales go. But that led to the sale to Green Thumb. So monetizing, taking an insight that very few people are willing to do, because in cannabis, if you're not willing to dig through the data, then you're just consensus. And we see consensus. If you're going to do that, you're better off giving money to an ETF or just investing in public companies. The second example, GrowGen. When I first brought GrowGen as an idea to people, everyone said the same thing. Home Depot is going to crush them. Well, I went to Home Depot's head of architecture, who builds out new Home Depots, and I asked him, would you ever really sell hydroponics? And he said, no, we can't. Our gardening centers are largely outdoor. Hydroponic equipment is expensive. It's electronic. We're never going to build a hydroponic center. We went heavy into GrowGen. I think people pretty much know the Merida story in GrowGen. It went up to, I think we invested before it went public at $1 a share, went up to $60 a share. It's back down like everything else in cannabis. But that insight, being willing to go to Home Depot directly, being willing to dig a little deeper is why we have so many professionals. And the last example is a kind of recent example, which is Missouri. So coming from the original operating space myself in Connecticut, Nevada, Minnesota, we saw adoption rates in Missouri Before the first cannabis was even on the radar, there was already 45,000 patients. There was another 4,400 a week that were looking for medical cards. So by getting that data from the Missouri state operation, we realized that we had to go heavy into Missouri because Missouri wasn't on a lot of people's radar as a potentially big medical state. But when you look at the rules, how lax the rules were, we saw Oklahoma, which has the best adoption rate in the country, but we saw limited licensing in Oklahoma type usage. So that led to 2 different investments. It's a full vertical now in Missouri. And Missouri, if anyone is in that state, then the numbers are phenomenal in Missouri. So those are past examples. What I normally don't do is talk about the future, but that's what I'm going to do right now. So here's 4 areas where Merida is seeing a lot of under-the-ground data that I don't think a lot of people are tracking or maybe have the inclination to track. But if you want to invest in public companies, that's fine. There's an easy articulation. The way Merida calls that is the future that is going to arrive. We all know that most of the MSOs are going to have big sales over the next couple of years because of what I showed you before, the adoption of legal sales from the formerly illegal market. And what's that being driven by? It's being driven by delivery and curbside, by giving people the same thing they get in the illegal market, but now in a legal way. Because we all know, I think we all know, if you're here, you believe in the legal market. And if you believe in the legal market, you believe that the quality, the choice, the access, and the safety of the legal market is superior to the illegal market. The only thing the illegal market does better is price. And we're going to get there eventually with scale. So once price has within 10% of parity, huge transition from the illegal market to the legal market. So there's 5 areas. So the 5 areas where we're seeing data that we feel is starting to become disruptive and showing us that people should pay a lot more attention. The first is energy water usage, the concept that cannabis is a very resource intensive plant. Well, when you actually look at some of the new technologies coming, the water usage isn't that heavy. Carbon dioxide is obviously good to remove from the air. Cannabis loves carbon dioxide. I mean, so much so that I was going to tweet about, I don't know if anyone saw that New York Mayor Eric Adams wants to grow cannabis on rooftops. Now, cannabis loves to absorb things from the air. So I don't know if anyone would want to smoke that, but I do think it's a good idea for removing carbon dioxide from the air. However, it is a cockamamie plan, but hey, anyone who's proposing anything in cannabis that moves the ball forward, we're all for. So we've already made 3 investments that we think back this concept of efficiency. So there's a new term that we use that I think people should be using a lot more in cannabis, which is precision ag tech. Right? Everyone talks about precision equipment, but if you think of how specific some of the companies that we're seeing, right? Because that's what's good about being at the tip of the spear in the industry, is we see companies, if you see 50 companies that are all pitching something similar, you realize that there's a revolution coming. So there's a revolution coming in ag tech and how efficient it is. And so we're using a term called precision ag tech, which I think is a good way to think of the new agricultural technology tools like carbon capture, using ozone to clean cannabis, drying technologies, using cameras to look for mold. There's a lot of great technology. A lot of those companies are niche, but for Merida, we're not just investors, we're company builders. So it's totally fine to have niche companies. The second thing is industrial hemp. There's a few partners of mine in the audience who all they do is talk about industrial hemp. But 3 years ago, when the ICC, which is an international licensing board, first thought of hempcrete as a potential building material, we used to make jokes. And I used to tweet hempcrete y'all as a joke about how big hempcrete was going to be. But the reality is that ICC certification just came. Everyone's going to be using hempcrete. But the other thing is cottonization, paper, pulping, biomaterials, bioplastics. Hemp is going to absolutely disrupt the traditional industrial materials. And so we've made 3 investments so far in the space. But those investments aren't about hemp itself. It's about the processing. So instead of doing what the consensus is doing, everyone invested in a hemp grow in the last 3 years or 4 years. We're more interested in the processing because that separates the tree from the forest. The third thing, which is something we scream about from the rooftops, but I don't know if anyone's listening, the medical side. Yes, with more consumer volume, and I'll get to that in the 5th point, but with more consumer volume, you get a lot more brand development and a lot more opportunity for that arbitrage when you're first building a brand. But most important, how many people are actually tracking all the cases that are coming down about workers' comp reimbursement, insurance reimbursement, law that just made out of the judiciary in New Jersey. It's also made out of a second committee. So New Jersey is on the verge of becoming the first state to mandate that workers' comp insurers carry cannabis as an approved alternative therapy. It's not necessarily just about the medical side itself, though. It's what does it say about the future? It tells me that form factors are going to matter, right? The ability to serve products that an insurance company is going to get behind. Is an insurance company going to be excited if a lot of their people are going and buying a pound of flour? Probably not. But are they going to care about microdosed or THCV or cannabinoid isolation or CBD-heavy products, patches? So we've invested in a Nebula, which is a public company that makes a product that will allow you to come down quickly if you have significant intoxication. They're in phase 2 trials. Laurel Harvest Labs was a Pennsylvania company that we built in the Chapter 20 program, which is the research program. It was recently sold to Cresco. Canacare Docs is a medical card licensing company that New Frontier now owns. Mana Molecular makes patches. Vela is their spinoff, which is making a product for sexual dysfunction that comes from antipsychotic or mood-altering drugs, which can affect people's libido. Mode is a precision dosing device that's kind of like this, where you'll be able to consume any type of 5-10 threaded, which is any product that's in a 5-10 thread. It has an algorithm that reads the cannabinoids in the vapor and tells you, it doesn't matter what brand, what label, it doesn't matter. It'll tell you what's in what you're consuming and tell you how long you need to consume it. So the precision medical data that's going to come out, we know that the federal government's eventually going to get to something, right? We know that. And when they do, research is going to explode and the medical side is completely overlooked. So if you're focused on public stocks, then you should look a little deeper into which public stocks are focusing more on the medical side. Because I think most MSOs would admit they're consumer product companies for the most part. They're not really medical companies. But there are a few that are differentiating themselves on the medical side, and we think that's worth, I know everyone here always wants to hear about what stocks they should buy. That's not our thing to tell you. All I'll say is that if you look at companies that are more skewed to the medical side, they have a better runway to land because not as many people are focusing on it. Another area, genetics and let's call it strain data. Yesterday I was late to come here because I was ringing the bell with Leafly, which Merida merger was our SPAC. Our target was Leafly. We recently de-SPAC'd. Not an easy thing to do in this world, which if you talk to a lot of SPACs and cannabis together is kind of like a toxic cocktail of really difficult environments right now. But ultimately we de-SPAC'd. The stock is trading phenomenal. We made investments in genetics. It's not, the data that tells us is how many times, if you're a grower and you're in this space, how many times has someone come to you and said, can you grow blank for me? Imagine a world where that is the arms race, where medical companies want you to grow specific strains so that you don't have to extract those cannabinoids. It's heavy in that already. So you're saving time, efficiency. Genetics is one of the next big land races. Rev Genomics, Henry's Original, which is an original grower out of they're an outdoor grower, indoor grower out of Mendocino County. Our view is you have to understand what's happening in these facilities. And what's happening in the facilities is people are growing for specific genetics, strains. And so think of the technology that it takes to create strong seeds that are feminized, that brings certainty to a grower. Anything that brings efficiency to a grower is going to get big traction in the next 2 to 3 years as every MSO looks for savings, as they look to bring their costs down. Because like I said, once you get to within 10% of the illegal market, that 60 billion or so that's still sold illegally in the United States, it transitions much quicker. And that transition is the single most important thing in cannabis. Everything you're doing, you have to think of normalization, because normalization is going to land on the cannabis industry in different places because there's no legalization yet. So you have to figure out which places are going to see that disproportionate growth. And so by using data points, again, we get this feedback from companies. You can see that genetics and strain data is becoming a massive arms race. And then the last thing, we were blown away by a recent New Frontier study, which New Frontier is a portco, and obviously investing in data companies is a good way to get good data. We were blown away by what we saw. 6 million pounds of cannabis were grown at home last year. 6 million pounds. That's $6 billion of cannabis. The legal market last year was 20 billion. So 33% of that number was grown at home by people in grows under 12 plants. I mean, that is a massive number, but it doesn't say something itself about home growing. It says something much deeper. It says that people have a direct personal connection to cannabis, a deeper connection. Someone who's willing to grow a plant at home, there are people that grow basil and they grow, herbs and stuff at home, but they also go to restaurants. But when you look at, not only do people grow at home and they grew, 6 million pounds, But those people also go to dispensaries twice a month because they're passionate about the plant. They're passionate about their connection to the plant. And so when you look at a lot of the things we've done recently, a lot of our investments, they deal with not the home-grown data itself, which we think is a huge canary in the coal mine. It tells us about that personal aesthetic. And when you get volume, when you get high volume in the market, more consumers consuming, more new consumers coming, where you can get the data. You've consumed for the first year. What did you consume in your first year? When you own the top of the funnel data in medical side or Leafly, when you're seeing the top of someone's discovery into cannabis, what you start to learn about is what people care about. And what people care about is what governs their consumer decisions. So whether it's a medical decision or a consumer decision, the home-grown data that we saw tells us about this evolving consumer aesthetic, this personal aesthetic. And what does that mean? It means GetLeaf is a home-growing technology because people want what we call idiot-proof ways to grow at home, right? Look, everyone knows the passionate guy that has the most beautiful home grow setup you've ever seen. But there are going to be people that want a refrigerator that does it themselves, where you just put the water and the nutrients in, you have a grow, you have a drying tray. Pilgrim Soul, the creative aspects of cannabis, drawing out that creativity of people when they consume cannabis. Huge element. Ms. Grass, which is women-focused. Her Highness, women-focused companies. Why? Because women are the fastest growing demographic of consumption. How do we know that? We read the data. The data is clear that women were originally reticent to get in the cannabis industry in 2005, 2006, 7, 8, because the illegality. So illegality actually drives more stigma when it comes to females than it does to males, right? So there were a lot of companies where the two adults were like the parents were both were partners, but the woman's name wasn't anywhere near there because the sense in early California was, I don't want to go to jail. One of us can't go to jail if we get busted. So when you look at a company like Jerome Baker Designs, the CEO of that company went to jail for selling accessories, bongs. If his significant other was also in that company, they both could have went to jail. So when you look at that, females were reticent, and now they're the fastest growing demo. Lowell Farms, obviously an authentic brand, which was originally called Indus. So what I want to leave you with is it's not just about finding that first piece of data. It's not finding that nugget. It's what you do with that information once you find those nuggets. And one of the reasons why we've built such a big investment team is because we want to consume every piece of data that we think is relevant. That's first. Then second, we want to look at what are the areas where we have to be based on what we just saw. Whether it's the guardrails, the ancillary companies in the space. I think I've listed 25 of the portfolio companies. I could list them all. They all have a relevance to this growing thesis that we have. But when you're thinking of investing in a public company per se, think of which public companies have a more defined view of that evolving consumer aesthetic. Which companies are building internal brands that are actually raising the profile of those companies in a dispensary? Which companies are collecting data that they can then use to target potentially ad tech on the internet? It's hard. Think about the fact that no cannabis consumer up until 2018 could do anything on the internet around their consumption. You could search, but could you actually transact? No. So the internet largely was a blank slate. So you now have this very fast evolving digital landscape. So how are people in the crowd? How are you investing in the digital landscape? The truth is you don't really have a way to articulate it if you're just investing in public companies. But now that Leafly's public, you have companies like Urban Grow where you can touch the data a little bit. But the truth is over the next 2 years, watch how many non-plant touching companies go public so that you can get a more diversified consumer aesthetic, a more diversified articulation of, again, not just the future that's going to arrive. That's the MSOs. Consumption drives volume, drives sales, drives that. Anyone can do that investment thesis, buy public companies. That's my advice to you for that. The future that will be built, much more difficult to invest in, much harder to find an articulation of that thesis. But the way you find the future that's going to be built is by taking interesting pieces of information and then digging as hard as you can and as deep as you can to find something that's differentiated. And so one of the things that I think is really important for people is you can listen to experts on which public stock to buy, and you can get Yahoo Finance information. But if you look a little deeper in the filings with those companies, you'll start to see who is articulating a medical thesis, who's articulating a consumer thesis, who's building brands, right? When you think of a Curaleaf or a Cresco or a GTI, Ben Kovler is always out there talking about rhythm. Cresco has Mindy's, Curaleaf has brands, Select. you know, when you think of those brands, we're not in a world where brand development mattered. So many people, and Canada was a great example of this, wasted billions building brands before the volume was there. If only 10 people were eating cookies in the United States, Oreo wouldn't be a very big brand, right? So you have to think of a world where normalization starts to settle on the space, the stigmas of illegality go away, consumption grows, and you want to articulate an investment thesis that's both public and private. But if you're going to stick to the publics, like I said, the best advice I have is to find pieces of information that lead you to other places, dig deep. You may go down a rabbit hole a little bit, but if you go down that rabbit hole, there's a huge reward. And I think the biggest thing is don't just focus on the trees. There's a huge forest out there, and the forest is going to be just fine. So thank you very much. Thanks to Ben Singer for having me.